Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the holding and the flow. This was inspired by Daniel Zaruba and Johannes Nieberhauser at the Halkyon Guild. They will be teaching a class on Japanese philosophy. Sign up before April 2nd. And I recently had a just wonderful discussion with Daniel Zaruba on Japanese philosophy and how in Japan there's this interesting emphasis on these between spaces, these certain conditions that have to be met, so certain aesthetic experiences can be experienced. We focused on a book called In Praise of Shadows by Tanizaki, and Michelle recently on Anchor did a conversation about it. You know, a shadow is pretty interesting. Very often, I think in the West, we can talk about shadows as if they're a simile for darkness, but shadows aren't merely darkness. You don't have shadows at night. Shadows appear in these spaces where there's both light and darkness, and there's interesting mixture. And you know, Tanizaki, he wants to kind of warn about how Western thought can be represented and by this artificial lighting, this constant illumination, this obsessive illumination. And you see, what that does is can create an impression from your environment, kind of a high order complexity and cause and effect that kind of teaches you that it's good to illuminate everything. And that can also lead you to have a philosophy and metaphysics of illumination, of trying to unveil all being. But you see, if there's something about the candle, for example, that creates a certain illumination in the room where there's a mixture between light and darkness, that can kind of teach you in that aesthetic that maybe veils, maybe concealment, that these things have a necessary role to create a certain beauty and a certain experience. And indeed, we can look at thinkers like in the Vico, in the Counter-Enlightenment, and some of those thinkers, and Hume. And, you know, in the Counter-Enlightenment, there would be this idea that rationality, unbound rationality, can become very destructive and can tear everything up. And that rationality ultimately has to be grounded, say, in a community or a tradition or something that I call non-rational, which came out in the discussions with John and David on Benjamin Fontaine. And without this non-rationality, then rationality ends up eating itself. It becomes autonomous rationality and becomes a force of totalitarianism and destruction. And this is brought out in the work on David Hume. Well, you know, in Japanese philosophy, there seems to be a deep understanding of that. There's a deep understanding of a need to have a mixture, a betweenness between light and darkness, rationality and non-rationality, the true and the rational, where not because rationality is bad, but because it needs to be in its proper bounds, because, you know, similarly, if you don't have truth, if you have just truth but not rationality, it's meaningless to you. You don't have a way to turn it into something that you can understand. Well, the very aesthetic, and I do think aesthetics influence our thinking. If we are in a world where everything is constantly illuminated, then that indirectly teaches us to think of illuminating, unveiling everything as good. And it then becomes natural, if we associate rationality with illumination, well, then we treat everything rationally, and then we give rise to all the problems described in Hume. And then also like in game theory, where you get Nash equilibrium. If everyone is rational, you get a suboptimal result in some situations. Without any metaphysics or philosophy of conditionality, of trying to balance conditions, of having rationality be conditioned so that it does not deconstruct itself, without any thinking like that, it's going to be very difficult to escape Nash equilibria, suboptimal results that result from everyone being rational. It's going to be very difficult to avoid autonomous rationality. So in this way, the Japanese can teach us something. It should also be noted that in order for there to be shadows, since light, you know, it's funny because light naturally devours shadow. So there has to be certain very fragile conditions that have to be upheld and maintained so that the shadow is not lost. And, you know, there's time and things change. So these conditions also have to be upheld through time. You have to uphold conditions and flow with time in a manner that you maintain the upholding of those conditions. You know, and so there's also something funny too, because the paper will talk about, say, atmosphere. Can you observe atmosphere? What is atmosphere? Well, there's a sense in which you observe atmosphere, and there's a sense in which you don't observe atmosphere. You walk into a room, you can just kind of feel the atmosphere. Is it there? Is it not? Well, what creates a cool atmosphere as well, like a special event, or a special situation is certain conditions are met. The people are in a good mood. Maybe the food is good, the lighting is good. All of these come together to create a certain atmosphere, and all the conditions have to be met to create that atmosphere, and they could all be lost. Do you observe that? Kind of, and yet you don't. So there's a sense in which a overly empirical society, or a society that believes the only real things are things that you can observe, would be one that would underemphasize or not appreciate atmosphere. Instead of atmosphere, it might emphasize objects or things in a room. It may not emphasize the overall experience. It may emphasize things. Well, a lot of people now, maybe we're getting better at this. There's a lot of talk now in neoliberalism how we need to get away from stuff. Capitalism, neoliberalism's a tricky term, but in capitalism, there's a need to get away from stuff for experiences per se. People are hard consumerism is a problem. But this book, In Praise of Shadows, was written a very long time ago, and now maybe we're starting to kind of wake up to the need to focus on experience here in America. But it's after falling into the meaning crisis and all the problems of a world where material is all there is, which, as discussed in the paper, explained versus addressed in the Philosophy of Black series with Cadell and Ebert and Tim. What you end up doing is, if you have this kind of raw materialism, you end up a world where people are explained but not addressed, and ergo they are explained away. And that leads to a lot of troubles. But as atmosphere is not really observed, it's just kind of sensed. It is observed, but it's not observed. But atmosphere, the key idea is that atmosphere is a result of conditions. It's not a result of non-conditional, objective, universal truths, such as emphasized in Western philosophy. But it's a result of this measured, weighed, balanced, harmonized variables that have to work in a certain way. Another example given in the paper is when you have two people bowing toward one another. There's nothing between them, and then they bend their backs, and they hold a certain posture, and then suddenly the space between them turns into almost a negative space that represents respect. Because they met the condition of shaping their body in a certain way and falling silent and holding that position, because those conditions were met, a meaning is conveyed, and the nothing between them turns into a negative space per se. The space between the individuals is no longer nothing. It becomes a kind of symbol of respect. Well, in order to turn nothing into such a symbol of respect, there are certain conditions that have to be met. Another example is based on the conversation with Mr. Jockin on typography. In order for some black marks on a paper to be a letter, there's a certain shape that they have to form. And for the letter A to even be a letter, you have to meet the condition of knowing English, for example. But then in order to get cat, to think of the phenomenon of a cat, the condition of the letter C, which has to be legible and readable, has to be met, and it has to come before the letter A and T. There are certain conditions that have to be met, and I have to meet the condition of being literate. But if all of those conditions are met, it becomes possible for me to experience the divide between the signifier and the signified that Derrida, deconstructs. It becomes, or attacks. It becomes possible for me to suddenly have an image in my head. And as hopefully reconstructing A as A makes clear, it is that moment of apprehension that is metaphysically extremely rich and extremely important. That's another topic, but Derrida attacks metaphysics because he says you can never close the gap between the word cat and the phenomenon of a cat, the signifier and the signified. And sure, maybe Derrida deconstructs all metaphysics of the gap per se, but I think the mistake is to think that deconstructing the metaphysics of the gap would consequently deconstruct the metaphysics of apprehension, or what I call reading in this instant. And that would likewise be the metaphysics of conditionalism, where there are these realities that emerge that are seen yet not seen, these metaphysical realities that emerge, like negative space, like atmosphere, like aura, beauty, I could go on. These things that these things that emerge under certain conditions but can't be reduced to those conditions. These very mysterious, evanescent, fleeting things, which of course are very different than what tends to be the concerns of Western philosophy, which are quote-unquote non-conditional universals, absolute, and so on and so forth. But I would argue that, there can be absolute truth. It just depends on what you mean by that, regarding lack, regarding certain phenomenological experiences, that we've made a mistake to believe that you can't have, that the choice is between absolutism and relativism. Conditionalism falls between that, and it certainly could be the case that quote-unquote capital T truths, if we want to talk about the capital B beings, could be suggested by conditions, by the meeting of certain conditions, as opposed to the finding of non-contingent principles, which I think has defined a lot of Western philosophy. So anyway, Eastern thought is going to emphasize these between spaces, these things you see but don't see, these conditionalisms, these auras, these atmospheres. But also, what's really important, and Mr. Zaruba in his class emphasizes this, and it's one of the reasons why I think it's a tremendous class, is all of these between entities are fragile, precisely because the conditions have to be maintained. Well, the likelihood of maintaining those conditions without being aware that we need to maintain those conditions because maybe we're drunk on overly non-conditional philosophy, it's very unlikely we will do it. And it's also very unlikely we'll do it if we've been trained by practices to help us identify how we maintain the conditions. We have to be very aware of our setting. We have to be very aware of details. We have to see, far from being a guy on a rock with our eyes closed, we have to have our eyes wide open. But we also have to know what to look for, and we need to know how to control our thoughts and to do all of these practices. So the other dimension that's interesting, once you begin to emphasize conditionalism, practice and act become critical. Because if certain conditions must be met in order for these very philosophically rich experiences to arise, which I actually think is the road to progressing metaphysics. A lot of people talk about the death of metaphysics, but arguably there's only a death in a metaphysics that tries to be non-conditional per se. But if we try to be conditional, you can see this new metaphysical horizon, new ontological possibilities and things like that, that also could avoid some of maybe the pitfalls of hard absolutism and hard non-contingency, which can indeed contribute to totalitarianism in different ways, and that would get you into your Adornos and Horkheimers and, again, your counter-enlightenment thinkers. But anyway, conditionalism requires practice and action and experience and embeddedness and embodiedness. And that's another thing that you're going to see in Eastern thought. Learning the practices of upholding conditions through the flow of change of time and life, of social condition, of social pressures, and things like that. All of this is emphasized and brought out in Mr. Zaruba's class at the Halkyon Guild, which he will be teaching with Johannes, and everyone should sign up before April 2nd. Please see the conversation I had. There's something in the description that you should see, and you should check out the conversation I had with Mr. Zaruba. And for more, please go to the Halkyon Guild. Johannes has tremendous videos on his page. Zaruba has just wonderful, I love his country strolls. I love his videos, his conversations. I've had the pleasure of having numerous conversations with him. And I highly suggest his work. And thank you so much for your time.